Good evening. This is The Digital Age. I'm Jim Zirin. Tonight we have a special program for you on our continuing coverage of terrorism and counterterrorism. January 9th last, Mayor Bloomberg testified before the Senate Committee on Homeland Security, and this is some of what he had to say.
Our administration has taken steps to strengthen all parts of our city, including our first line of defense, the NYPD. We created a unique counterterrorism bureau and overhauled the NYPD's intelligence division, both units which now employ a total of 1,000 police officers, and they've become a model to other big city police departments around the nation and crucial weapons in the global fight against terrorism.
Tonight we are privileged to have with us a major player in the global fight against terrorism, a policy planner drafted onto the front lines of New York City's own war on terror. Richard Falkenrath leads the Counterterrorism Bureau. He is the Deputy Commissioner of the New York City Police Department, a former member of the National Security Council staff, advisor to President Bush on Homeland Security matters, a frequent witness before congressional committees on terror-related issues, and former academic specialist on Homeland Security. Richard Falkenrath, welcome.
Thank you, Jim.
Let's start with a question on everyone's mind. How safe are we in New York today?
Well, I think the average citizen's pretty safe from terrorism, certainly. I think the odds of any one person being the victim of a terrorist attack at any one time are very low. As a city, though, we have to live with the reality that we are at the top of Al-Qaeda's target list, and will be so for the foreseeable future. So I personally wake up every day thinking today could be the day for another attack. I fervently hope it is not. We do everything we can to prevent it, but it is a reality that we live with.
Can you really protect a city with so many potential targets? We have the stock exchange, we have the Statue of Liberty, national monuments, national treasures.
Well, even more than that, we have freedom and openness, which makes it very easy for people to move around and to plan and conduct attacks if they do. So no, there is no perfect defense. The only perfectly defended society would be a police state, and we don't live in a police state. We live in a very free and open society, and that is where our vulnerability to this form of attack comes from.
Now, up until last year, you were in Washington at Brookings, contemplating security policy. Whatever possessed you to take this job?
So it's a very interesting question. Really, I wanted to get back in the fight. I had left the Bush administration in summer 2004. After 3.5 years there, they were 3 very wonderful, hard, important years, but I was tired and I needed a break. So I took a break, took 2 years off, I did some writing, I did some speaking and traveling, and then one day, the Commissioner of Police called me up. And he
out
said,
of the blue?
Out of the blue. I was standing in an airport about to catch an international flight, and he called up and he said, "Hey, Rich, do you know Mike Sheehan? He's my predecessor." I said, "Yeah, he's a great guy." He said, "Well, he's leaving. Are you interested in the job?" And he could have knocked me over with a feather. I wasn't looking for a job. It came out of the blue.
So when did you, a Californian, come on board here in New York City?
I started in July 10th.
2006.
Yeah, and my wife and I bought a house a month later, and we moved up the kids the month after that.
And since July, what does your day look like? Maybe you give us an idea of what you're doing.
It starts pretty early. I usually get in the office around, I get in the office about 8 and start doing intelligence preparation. I get a briefing from the Joint Terrorism Task Force, from other sources that we monitor, and then I and the Deputy Commissioner for Intelligence go and brief the Police Commissioner every morning at 9 on what's happening in New York with our investigations and intelligence work, and what's happening worldwide. That's the beginning. And then after that, it's a sort of never-ending series of briefings and meetings with other people around the town, with my own staff. It wraps up, in the evening sometime. I get home, hopefully, before the kids are asleep.
Tell us something about the Joint Terrorism Task Force. That didn't exist before 9/11, did it?
Well, yes, it did. This Joint Terrorism Task Force was actually established in 1980. It was the first one. And it was a venue where the FBI brought in other law enforcement agencies to assist in terrorism investigations that were ongoing, to make sure that the law enforcement agencies didn't bump into each other while they were conducting wiretaps or serving warrants. And so it's a long-standing task force, but it was quite small prior to 9/11. The NYPD only had about, I think, 18 detectives assigned to it. The FBI had, maybe under 100 special agents assigned to it. After 9/11, it was dramatically enlarged.
Well, there was no Counterterrorism Bureau in the NYPD before 9/11.
That's right. There was no Counterterrorism Bureau in the NYPD. It was the handful of detectives who were part of the JTF were part of the Detective Bureau. And then after Mayor Bloomberg was elected and Ray Kelly came on as commissioner, they created the Counterterrorism Bureau, which I have the privilege to lead.
Now, of course, the 9/11 Commission was critical of the lack of information sharing between and among intelligence agencies and also between intelligence agencies and law enforcement agencies and the FBI. And that's been referred to as the silo effect.
Yeah.
Do we still have silos, or is there a satisfactory level of information sharing?
Well, we're never completely satisfied with anything in this business. It can always get a little bit better. But the problem that was articulated by the 9/11 Commission was very, very bad, and it's gotten a lot better. The quality of information sharing within the federal government and then laterally with some state and local agencies now is pretty good. And currently here in New York, the information sharing between the FBI, which is the most important federal agency for counterterrorism investigation, and the NYPD is excellent and is really, I think, unique in the country with how deep and wide it is. And we're, I think, advantaged at NYPD that we have 3 top officials, all with considerable federal experience. Myself, the commissioner, the deputy commissioner for intelligence, and the police commissioner have all served in the federal government. So we sort of know what's out there. We know how it works. We know who calls the shots, how they collect the information, how it's presented, and we can often figure out if we're not getting everything we need and then find a way to get what we need.
Do you interface directly with the FBI and the CIA, or is it all through the Joint Terrorism Task Force?
It's not all through the Joint Terrorism Task Force. A lot of it is there. But we have the ability to go to Washington directly to the other agencies, and we do that a lot.
Do you have free access to their databases, for example?
The NYPD detectives who are attached to the Joint Terrorism Task Force do. They are federal officers. They are credentialed as deputy U.S. Marshals, and they have top secret security clearances, and they see everything.
How many police officers are there attached to the Counterterrorism Bureau?
The Counterterrorism Bureau total is about 250 standing staff, and then it's augmented every day with several hundred who are deployed in the field who conduct our critical response operations.
Well, by deployed in the field, that would include officers in other countries. Isn't that right?
That's correct. There are 10 NYPD detectives deployed abroad in 8 countries, and they're part of the intelligence division. I was actually just with 2 of them, one in London and one in Singapore.
It was said that your officers were the first on the scene of any foreign police force at the time of the Madrid bombing. This is the train bombing in Madrid, isn't that right?
I think that's right.
Yeah.
I was at the White House at the time of the Madrid bombing, and I do know there was a considerable lag before we got detailed information on that attack. And I have heard, Ted, that the NYPD detective was there more quickly.
Now, you've told us something about your relations with the federal intelligence agencies and intelligence community and the law enforcement agencies, but what about your relationships with the Department of Homeland Security? Have they been wholly satisfactory?
Some parts are very satisfactory, some parts are not. We don't have one relationship with the Department of Homeland Security, we have many. The department, even though it's all been subordinated to the Secretary, is still many different departments. So I like to say there's not one DHS, there's 12 DHSs, and we have a separate account with every one of them, and each account requires us to service it. Some are satisfactory, some are not.
Well, there's been attention, has there not, in the past about threat level. The NYPD said there was a serious threat of an attack on the subways. The Department of Homeland Security at the same time said there was not. I mean, have issues like that been resolved? Do you think it's a better situation than it was at the time?
That particular incident occurred before I got here, so I didn't live through it. I talked about it on television as an analyst on TV.
What'd you say?
What I said was that I understood where both sides were coming from. I mean, the NYPD had highly specific information about a highly specific threat to the city. Now, the intelligence community believed the threat was not credible, but nonetheless, it was sitting there on the table, staring you in the face. And it would be unconscionable, I think, for the police department not to react to that in a vigorous way, because we're presented with this information, authoritative information, and without the ability to directly evaluate the source, who in this case happened to have been in Iraq, managed by another federal agency, not even DHS. So I think what the department did at the time was appropriate, and certainly we do it again today. There's no question. Now, DHS, who was may or may not have been the one who distributed the information to the local agencies, then on background briefed people about how they evaluated the credibility of that source. Probably would have been better for them to keep that counsel private and to not share it, while another agency was busily trying to protect the people who lived in its city, namely the NYPD.
But of course, the DHS is headed by Secretary Michael Chertoff. He's an old New Jersey boy. The department has said there are no important monuments or icons in New York City, zero. Their threat assessment for New York, they've lumped with Connecticut and New Jersey in the past. And you've been critical of this, the log rolling and the pork barreling that's gone on where, for political reasons, counterterrorism federal funds have been channeled to Kansas and to Wisconsin and places that pose much less of a target than New York City. Have any of these conflicts been resolved?
Not really. They're sort of part of our federal system. They're very depressing, and as you get into the grant process for state and local agencies, it really wears you down. I was involved in setting some of the initial Homeland Security budget and guidelines from the White House, and to see now from this new vantage point how it's actually implemented is really discouraging. The part that troubles me most is the discretionary part. You know, Congress specifies how some of the money is going to be spent. They write in some formulas into the law, and they make it clear that it's going to be spread more or less evenly across the country for certain pots of money. But there are other pots where the Secretary has some discretion. And what is most discouraging is when the department elects not to use that discretion in an aggressive way that targets the highest risk, that continues to spread it around and respond to the political pressures of, frankly, less populous areas. And that still goes on far too much. We're waiting to see what the 2007 grant will look like. 2006 was very unsatisfactory from the city. I'm hopeful, but not optimistic it's going to be a lot better in 2007.
Well, after the mayor testified, the Department of Homeland Security announced a $90 million grant, of which $61 million would be for upgraded transportation security, at least in the metropolitan area. Do you feel that was sufficient? 61 million of the 90 million was supposed to be for metropolitan transit.
The total pot of Homeland Security grants for in all the different accounts is in the neighborhood of $4 billion. So 60 million out of that is relatively small.
Drop in the bucket.
Yeah, it's a drop in the bucket. And that grant is one where they didn't have a whole lot of discretion over how to spend it. You know, transit security, mass transit security, subways are one of the major vulnerabilities. Al-Qaeda is attacking them again and again abroad, most vividly in Madrid and in London. Our subway system is the biggest in the country by far. 2 out of every 3 subway rides in America is on the New York City subway. So if we think Al-Qaeda is going to attack a subway in America, it stands to reason they're going to attack this place. And by that analysis, it seems to me appropriate that the preponderance of the mass transit grant money come here.
How much does New York City spend annually for counterterrorism?
I only know the answer to that for the police department, and we reckon it's about $200 million for the police department. There are, however, other agencies, you know, fire department, OEM, health department, DEP, and then there are state agencies who are here, MTA, who operates the subways. That's some valuable expenditures.
But at the moment, the last I looked, for example, Homeland Security had only allocated $4.34 per capita for bioterrorism in New York. I mean, it's certainly woefully inadequate, wouldn't you think?
I mean, it's a low number,
yeah.
But I think the federal culprit there is the Department of Health and Human Services.
Yeah.
Further showing you how fractured the funding schemes are in Washington.
Now, the mayor spoke of your Counterterrorism Bureau as being unique. That was his characterization. Aren't there counterterrorism bureaus in other cities?
Not to my knowledge, and certainly nothing the size of what we have. I mean, one of the things about NYPD is so extraordinary is how big it is. It's really the biggest police department in the country by a large margin, and that size allows it to specialize in ways like our Counterterrorism Bureau and our Intelligence Division. And the other police departments in the country are just not big enough. Now, I do believe a few of them are starting to create some staff elements focused on terrorism in one way or another. But I doubt very much that they're as big as ours.
Do you believe there are terrorist cells operating in New York City right now?
I certainly come to work with that assumption. I think that's our responsibility with jobs like this, that's how you motivate yourself. I don't know that there are. If there are, we'd deal with them in an appropriate way. But I think it's appropriate for someone with a job like mine to assume that there are.
Any arrests since you assumed office?
Well, there have been some, yeah.
There have been terrorist arrests, and they've been prosecuted by the federal government or locally, or?
Most terrorism cases end up in federal court.
Yeah.
And so most of those arrests are made jointly through the JTF, but not all of them. There's a very important conviction that was just handed down of an individual who was planning to bomb the Herald Square subway station. And that was a conviction in federal court, but a case made by the NYPD Intelligence Division, acting separately.
Yeah, that was brought here in Brooklyn, I think. Yeah. Now, in New York, we have, of course, a multicultural society, and we have a substantial Islamic community. Do you find that members of that community come forward and give information to the New York City Police Department about terrorist activities?
Well, some certainly do. I think many New Yorkers do. We get hundreds of calls into our NYC Safe line, which takes these calls, and some will be from Muslims and some will be from non-Muslims, and we want to get the tips from anybody. And I think these are people who they value their safety and security just as much as everybody else. And they have given us some information from time to time. And we take it. Sometimes we'll take it anonymously. Sometimes we'll file a report. But they're part of our city just like everyone else.
But I think you have spoken out in the past about the Muslim community perhaps being a breeding ground for terrorists, and for a great fear, not from Al-Qaeda operatives coming in from abroad, as was the case in 9/11, but from homegrown terrorists, and that this is a distinct and disturbing possibility. What do you make of that?
Well, it is a possibility, and one that we have to be very careful about. I mean, I think this radical extremist element in the Muslim population is very small relative to the total Muslim population, but it is there. And we would be naive to think that the phenomenon we've seen in London and Madrid could not manifest here. Indeed, we see a few of the precursors of it.
And so that was homegrown?
In part.
In part, you know.
Yeah. It's sort of like 6 degrees of separation. If you do enough link analysis, you'll find a link back to others abroad almost always. But it wasn't like 9/11, which was a plot hatched and conceived abroad and then very methodically deployed into the country as one that, to a greater extent, grew up from the grassroots. And that possibility exists in this city, and it's our job to be alert to that and to look out for it.
Is the internet a factor either in the apprehension of terrorists or in radicalizing members of perhaps of the Muslim community, and so that they become terrorists where it wouldn't otherwise be the case?
Yes and yes.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
There's nothing we can do about it, of course. The internet is what it is, but it is a source of a lot of information about how to conduct a terrorist attack, how to build bombs, for instance. That's all readily available on the internet. Nothing we can do about that. And it is a place where people who might be inclined toward extremism or militancy can go to get texts and statements and videos and images that accelerate that process inside of them, and then they can make contact with others. It is one of many possible sources of radicalization for someone who was susceptible to being radicalized. And it's well known that law enforcement intelligence agencies try to exploit that, and they try to, like any communication system, penetrate it in lawful ways, and occasionally are successful.
In Senate testimony, you've downplayed the net and technology. This is contrary perhaps to conventional wisdom as the primary tool in detecting and combating terrorism, and you said the #1 tool is manpower. Yeah. Do you feel that, I still feel that's the case?
Well, I said something a little bit different. What I downplayed was electronic surveillance, and what I said was electronic surveillance needed to be complemented with human intelligence. So electronic surveillance is basically the ability to do wiretaps, either internationally or domestically. Internationally,
well, you had video surveillance, which was important in London, and at least identifying the terrorists.
But you had to find the people to do the video surveillance for, and then conduct it. And video surveillance is very important once you're onto a conspiracy. But the question is, where are your tripwires? How do you find out who it is that you should be looking at more closely? And for that, electronic surveillance is really quite limited. Once you're onto somebody, it's a very powerful tool, and you need to use it a lot, and we do. The U.S. government does. The question is, how do you get onto somebody in the first place? Abroad, we have a mosaic of different intelligence collection techniques and relationships. At home, frankly, they're much more limited. And so the question we face is, what are our tripwires for homegrown terrorist threat? How are we going to find out about it in the first place so we can go investigate it more aggressively? And that's a tough question that the country, frankly, has not figured out an answer to.
How about officers undercover penetrating terrorist cells?
That's human intelligence.
And that certainly would be an obvious technique to be used by Counterterrorism Bureau.
Indeed. It's one of the, human intelligence is partly undercover officers and partly sources who are recruited to provide you information.
Now, are you involved at all with Operation Atlas? Does that
Yes.
still exist? Tell us about that.
Well, Operation Atlas, referred to it earlier, is our program for deploying in a very visible way police officers around the city to vulnerable targets, targets that have been cased by terrorists or by Al-Qaeda in the past. And it's driven by intelligence, so we sort out every day, usually the night before, where they're going to go. And then every precinct will send one radio car with 2 police officers in it and their supervisors to a central rallying point. And then they're going to get their orders on where to go. They'll get a briefing from an intelligence specialist or a counterterrorism officer, and they'll deploy around the city. Then they'll have a mid-tour rally, and they'll deploy again. And it's an operation designed to combat the surveillance and casing techniques that we know are a part of Al-Qaeda's method. We've been cased, the city has been cased before. People have come here, taken pictures, written reports about how to attack our iconic targets. And since that's happened, our response is, okay, well, if you're going to be casing it, we're going to make sure that you see a highly visible and powerful police presence at those sites when you're there.
But you're mobilizing against an almost invisible enemy, isn't it?
That's right. You are. And it's expensive. The city has made a major investment into this. It's an innovative technique. I was just in Singapore, and the Singaporean government has adopted this technique as well. They call it Operation Javelin. City of London, Scotland Yard, have a variant as well. So it's very expensive things to do. It requires a lot of leadership to organize, but it's an important technique.
And this would account for these caravans of police cars that we see from time to time.
It could well be what we call a CRV, Critical Response Vehicle package.
So next time I see one, I'll call you up and say, is that one of them?
You could do that.
I might not get an answer.
I might not tell you.
Yeah. Watch lists. Do you have watch lists? You check off people against in New York against terrorist watch lists?
Well, it's sort of a term of art. I mean, the police department has a number of databases of people with outstanding warrants or prior convictions that will be checked against. A watch list is a little bit different, and mostly the federal government maintains the watch list, because these are people that they don't necessarily have a criminal record, they don't necessarily have an outstanding warrant, but the intelligence community has some reason to be suspicious about them. And that the precise nature of that reason can't be readily divulged to that person or to other agencies. And so that list is called a watch list. We have the ability to check against federal watch lists. Sometimes that's done routinely, sometimes exceptionally. It's a little bit different from what the police department maintains.
In his 2007 State of the City speech, Mayor Bloomberg seemed to give increased responsibility to the fire department in the downtown security initiative for transportation security and and other areas of security in the downtown area. Does that mean a diminished responsibility for the NYPD?
I don't think so. I mean, the fire department has a very important job. It's a very proud agency. It's a wonderful agency. I had many friends in the fire department before I came to New York City. But in the area of transportation security and preventing terrorist attacks, I think it's pretty clear that the police department have the biggest job to do.
There is also, in the 2006 speech, the mayor established a security protocol where the police commissioner was to sit on the board of the Transit Authority and also the MTA and also the Port Authority. That's happened, has it not?
I don't think the police commissioner is on the boards of them, certainly not of the Port Authority. Actually, former Governor Pataki vetoed a bill that would have added the police commissioner to the board of the Port Authority. But we deal with them a lot, and we have some really excellent working relationships with them when we really need to work together. There's frictions from time to time, of course, but it's not our governance structures are not commingled.
Now, I know you hate to identify any area of particular vulnerability because that's, of course, an invitation to terrorists, but in the past you've focused on chemical plant toxic vulnerability. Is that still a high area of vulnerability, or have we improved our capabilities in that area?
The country has not improved its capability in that area much at all. New York City is sort of fortunate that it doesn't have a whole lot of chemical plants.
But there's a lot in New Jersey.
There are some in New Jersey, and certainly it's possible that an attack in New Jersey would sort of waft over the city and be, and that is a possibility. I think the greater danger is actually the more immediate environs of that.
What about toxic chemicals and trucks coming through the city?
We're worried about that. We do our best to monitor it, and we certainly we conduct periodic operations to check for that, and there are some coming to the city that worry us.
Do you feel that we have improved our capabilities in these areas of toxic chemicals?
Well, we certainly have more personnel prepared to deal with it if the attack happens or if there is a catastrophic release. The country's total exposure to toxic industrial chemicals is still way too high and should be reduced.
Well, we've come to the time we have to wrap up. This has been absolutely delightful, but I have a question for you. You believe we're any safer than we were on 9/11?
We are safer.
Why?
Than we were on 9/11. The country was asleep on 9/11. These vulnerabilities that we have, the possibility of terrorist attack was really sort of esoterica. People weren't paying attention. And there was a huge terrorist conspiracy with a sanctuary in Afghanistan, planning and plotting and recruiting to attack us. There are still remnants of that conspiracy, but they've been dealt a serious blow.
Dealt a serious blow. Richard Falkenrath, thank you so much for coming by. This has really been a pleasure. And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more on the digital age. For the digital age, I am Jim Zirin. Thank you, and all the best.